We begin in a quiet place, a place far from here and far from now. The year is somewhere around 1340. The world is much smaller then. Most people never travel more than a few miles from where they were born. They know their village. They know their fields. They know the road to the nearest town. And that is enough. Europe at this time is a continent of small communities. Villages sit close to rivers and forests. Farmland stretches out in long strips behind rows of simple homes. The homes are made of wood and clay and thatch. They are small and warm in winter from the fire at the center. Smoke drifts upward through a hole in the roof. Families sleep close together, near the animals sometimes, for warmth. Life moves slowly here. The days are organized around work. The seasons are organized around the harvest. And the harvest determines whether the coming year will be easy or hard. People in medieval Europe are deeply connected to the land. A farmer rises before dawn. He tends to his animals first. Then he walks out into the field. His tools are simple. A wooden plow sometimes tipped with iron. A scythe for cutting grain. Cart for carrying. He works through the morning. His wife tends the garden near the house, watches the children, prepares food. There is bread, usually. There are vegetables, turnips, onions, beans. Sometimes there is salted meat or dried fish. Meals are plain and filling. Wine and ale are common drinks, safer than water in many places. The towns are a little different. Towns have streets, though they are narrow and often muddy. There are markets where farmers bring their goods to sell. There are craftsmen, blacksmiths, tanners, weavers, bakers. There are churches, always. The church is at the center of community life. Bells mark the hours of the day. People pray in the morning and in the evening. Religious life is woven into the ordinary hours of every week. This is the world before the plague. It is not a perfect world. There is hunger in bad years. There is war in some regions. There is disease, as there always is. But there is also stability. There is routine. People are accustomed to their lives, and their lives follow patterns that have existed for generations. Now we move east. We move toward the region between China and Central Asia. The steppes of Central Asia are vast grasslands, largely empty to human eyes. But the land is crossed by merchants and traders. It is crossed by the routes that connect China to the Mediterranean world. These routes are old. Goods have moved along them for centuries. Silk and spices travel westward. Silver and glass travel eastward. And along these same routes, the plague will eventually travel too. The disease that causes the Black Death is believed to have originated somewhere in Central Asia. The exact location is still debated by historians and scientists. But somewhere in that vast region, in the late 1330s or early 1340s, the illness was already present. It exists in animal populations, particularly rodents, for long periods of time. It spreads from animals to humans through the bite of fleas. Small, ordinary fleas, living on the fur of rats and other rodents. When an infected flea bites a person, it can transmit the illness. The person then becomes sick. The disease is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It is invisible to the human eye. People of the 14th century do not know what a bacterium is. They do not have the tools to see it. They do not understand germ theory, which will not be developed for another 500 years. They only know what they can see. They see people becoming sick. They see the sickness spreading, and they try to understand it with the knowledge they have. The illness can take several forms. The most common form in this period causes painful swellings under the skin. These swellings appear near the lymph nodes, in the groin, under the arm, or on the neck. They are sometimes called buboes, which is where the name bubonic plague comes from. The swellings are hard and painful. They can grow to the size of an egg or sometimes larger. Along with the swellings come fever and exhaustion. The skin may darken in some cases. People become very weak very quickly. Some people die within a few days. Others last a week or slightly more. A smaller number recover. There is also a form that spreads through the air. When the illness affects the lungs, it can be passed from one person to another through breathing. This form moves faster. It is more deadly, and it requires no fleas at all. Just the air between two people, one of whom is very sick. The illness moves westward slowly at first, then more quickly. It travels through trading networks. It travels with merchants and their cargoes. It travels on ships. It moves at the pace of human movement in the 14th century, which is slow by modern standards but constant. Ships sail. Caravans walk. People move, and with them the illness moves too. By the mid-1340s, the plague has reached the shores of the Black Sea. There is a trading city there called Caffa. It is a Genoese colony, a port where merchants from Italy do business with traders from the east. It is a busy, crowded place. Ships arrive and depart regularly. Goods are loaded and unloaded on the docks. People from many different places meet here. In 1346, the illness has reached the populations around Caffa. The city comes under pressure from the outside as well. There are accounts of people becoming sick within and around the region. The exact details of this period are recorded in a small number of documents from the time. One account describes the scene along the trading routes near the Black Sea. Bodies, whole communities suffering at once. A sickness moving faster than people can explain. By 1347, ships begin to leave Caffa carrying their cargoes westward. They sail across the Black Sea. They pass through the narrow strait into the Mediterranean. They head toward the ports of Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. On board these ships, among the sailors and passengers and cargo, the illness is already present. Some accounts from the time describe ships arriving with most of the crew dead. A few surviving sailors, weak and sick, managing the vessel into harbor. In the autumn of 1347, ships arrive at the port of Messina in Sicily. The people on the docks notice something wrong. The sailors who disembark are pale. Some have the swellings. Some are barely able to walk. The authorities of Messina quickly try to turn the ships away, but it is already too late. The illness has reached the island. From Sicily, the plague moves to the mainland of Italy. It reaches the port of Genoa in early 1348. It reaches Venice. It reaches Pisa. The Italian cities of the 14th century are among the most populated in Europe. They are centers of trade and banking. Their streets are crowded. Their ports are busy. These conditions make it easy for the illness to spread. Florence is one of the great cities of medieval Europe. It is a city of art and learning. It has a population of perhaps 80 or 90,000 people in the years before the plague. The streets are full of life. Merchants conduct business in the open air. Cloth is dyed in workshops along the river. Churches are decorated with new paintings. The city is prosperous and full. The plague arrives in Florence in the spring of 1348. A Florentine writer named Giovanni Boccaccio is present in the city during this time. He will later write about what he witnessed. His account, written in the introduction to his book, The Decameron, describes the illness clearly and carefully. He writes about the swellings. He writes about how quickly people died. He writes about the disruption to ordinary life. His words are one of the most detailed accounts we have of the plague in an Italian city. Boccaccio describes the city changing. He writes that ordinary social bonds began to loosen. People who were sick were sometimes avoided even by those who loved them. Some families did not care for their sick relatives. Some neighbors did not help those next door. This is not a simple story of cruelty. It is a story of fear, and of a situation that was entirely new. Nothing in living memory had prepared anyone for this. The doctors of Florence and other cities try to help. They do what they can with the knowledge they have. Treatments in this period include herbs, bleeding, and lancing the swellings. None of these are effective against the bacterium. But the physicians are not doing nothing. They are applying the best medical knowledge of their time. They observe. They record. They try different approaches. Some physicians continue working even when the risk to themselves is very high. The church plays an important role during the plague years. Priests hear confessions and administer last rites. This is considered essential in medieval Christian belief. A person who dies without proper religious care is thought to be at spiritual risk. So priests continue working. Many of them die. The clergy suffer significant losses during this period. Monasteries where monks live in close community are particularly vulnerable. When the illness enters a monastery, it can move through quickly. By the middle of 1348, the plague is moving through much of Italy. It moves north through the Alpine passes. It enters France. It spreads through the south of France in the summer and autumn. It reaches Paris. Paris in the 14th century is a large city by the standards of the time. It has universities and markets and churches. It has a dense population. The illness finds conditions in Paris similar to those in Italy. Close quarters, crowded streets, and no understanding of how it spreads. In Paris, the university has a medical faculty. The King of France asks the physicians of Paris to explain the plague. They produce a written report in 1348. The report concludes that the plague was caused by a particular alignment of the planets. They believed that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had come together in a way that corrupted the air. Bad air, called miasma in the thinking of the time, was believed to carry illness. This idea was not unique to medieval physicians. It was based on classical Greek and Roman medicine, specifically the theories of the ancient physician Galen. The miasma theory, the idea that bad air causes disease, will remain influential for centuries. It shapes how people respond to the plague. If bad air is the cause, then the solution is to purify the air. People burn aromatic woods and herbs. They carry flowers and perfumes. They believe that strong, pleasant smells might counteract the corrupted air. We know now that these actions had no effect on the bacterium, but they represent a sincere attempt to respond to something terrifying and incomprehensible. The plague moves through France and into the Iberian Peninsula. Spain and Portugal are affected by late 1348. It moves north through France into what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. It crosses the English Channel. England first encounters the plague in the summer of 1348. It arrives at the southern ports. Weymouth, on the southern coast, is sometimes cited as an early point of entry. From the ports, it moves inland. It spreads along the roads and rivers that connect English towns. England in 1348 is a kingdom of perhaps 4 to 5 million people. Most of them live in villages. The towns are small by continental standards. London is the largest, with perhaps 70 or 80,000 people. The English landscape at this time is a mix of farmland and forest. Sheep are important to the economy. Wool is a major export. The rolling countryside is dotted with small churches and market towns. The plague reaches London in the autumn of 1348. It spreads through the city over the winter months. The dead need to be buried. Normal burial practices require time and ceremony. But when many people are dying at once, the normal processes are difficult to maintain. New burial grounds are established outside the city. Mass graves are dug in some places to handle the large numbers of dead. It is difficult to know exactly how many people died. The records from the 14th century are incomplete. Estimates vary considerably among historians. But many scholars now believe that between a third and a half of Europe's population died during the initial outbreak of the Black Death. In some regions, the death rate was lower. In others, particularly in crowded towns and cities, it was higher. Some communities lost the majority of their inhabitants. The plague does not move in a smooth wave. It moves unevenly. Some places are badly affected. Others, for reasons that are not fully understood, experience lighter impact. A few communities seem to escape almost entirely. Scholars have noted that some regions in Poland, for example, appear to have been less severely affected than surrounding areas. The reasons for this variation are still studied and debated. As the plague moves north through England, it enters the countryside. Villages experience it differently from cities. In a village, everyone knows everyone. When the illness arrives, it is immediately visible. A neighbor becomes sick, then another. There is no anonymity in a village. The fear is personal and immediate. Some villages in England that were abandoned during or after the plague years can still be seen today. These are called deserted medieval villages. Their outlines remain in the ground. Grassy humps and ditches mark where houses and lanes once were. They are quiet places now, a reminder that people once lived and worked in those fields. The plague reaches Scotland and Ireland during 1349. It spreads into Scandinavia in the same year. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark all experience significant outbreaks. The illness travels on the ships that cross the North Sea. Norway in particular loses a large proportion of its population. Some estimates suggest that Norway's population may have taken over a century to begin recovering. The plague also spreads eastward. It moves through Germany. It reaches Poland and Central Europe. By the early 1350s, it has returned to regions of Russia and Eastern Europe. The geographical spread of the initial outbreak is enormous. It covers most of the Eurasian landmass over a period of roughly 5 to 7 years. During the years of the plague, ordinary life continues in complicated ways. People still need to eat. Farmers still need to tend their fields, even when they are sick with fear or grief. Bread still needs to be baked. Animals still need to be fed. Life does not simply stop, but it is altered deeply. The labor shortage that the plague creates is significant. When a large portion of the workforce dies, there are fewer people to do the work. Farmers die, and their fields may go untended. Craftsmen die, and their workshops close. Servants die, and great houses cannot find enough people to staff them. This creates a shift in the relationship between landowners and workers. Workers who survive find that their labor is more valuable. Some begin to negotiate for better conditions. In England, this will eventually contribute to tensions that lead to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, some decades later. The plague also changes the church. The clergy suffer serious losses. When priests die, they need to be replaced. In the years after the initial outbreak, the church trains new clergy more quickly. Some argue that the quality of religious education declines as a result. New priests enter service with less training than those before them. This is one of many ways the plague reshapes institutions that took generations to build. The Jewish communities of medieval Europe suffer particularly during the plague years. There are accusations in some regions that Jewish people caused the plague. This is completely false. Jewish communities suffered from the plague just as other communities did. But fear and uncertainty in this period lead to violence against Jewish people in some places. Pogroms occur in parts of Germany and France. Jewish communities are expelled from some towns. These events are documented in medieval records. The Pope of the time, Clement VI, issues statements condemning the violence. But the violence continues in some places regardless. There is also a religious movement that emerges during the plague years. Groups of people called flagellants travel through parts of Germany and the Low Countries. They practice public acts of self-punishment. They believe that suffering is a way to appease divine anger. They travel in processions, stopping in towns and cities to perform their rituals. Their movement spreads quickly in 1349. The Church eventually condemns the flagellant movement, but it reflects the deep anxiety and spiritual searching that the plague provokes. Art changes after the plague. One of the most striking artistic themes of the later 14th century is the image of death. The dance of death, known in French as the danse macabre, becomes a common subject. It shows figures of death leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, merchants, peasants, in a procession. The message is simple and universal. Death comes for everyone. Rank and wealth do not protect you. This theme reflects a shift in how people think about mortality. Death is present everywhere in the later medieval world, and art begins to reflect that presence. The initial outbreak, the one that sweeps through Europe between 1347 and roughly 1353, but it is not the only outbreak. The plague returns. It comes back in waves over the following decades and centuries. In England, for example, there are significant outbreaks in 1361, 1369, and 1374, among others. Each return of the plague keeps the population from recovering quickly. Europe's population, which had been growing through the 12th and 13th centuries, will not return to pre-plague levels until the 16th century in many regions. Some areas take even longer. The 1361 outbreak is sometimes called the Children's Plague. This is because many of those who survived the initial outbreak of 1347 to 1353 had developed some degree of resistance or immunity. But children born after the first outbreak had not been exposed. They were more vulnerable. The 1361 outbreak took a particularly high toll among the younger generation. This pattern of new outbreaks affecting those born since the previous one repeats across the plague centuries. The daily rhythms of life in a post-plague village are different from what came before. There are empty houses. There are fields that once belonged to families now gone. Land changes hands. Inheritances pass to distant relatives, or sometimes to institutions like churches and monasteries. Some survivors find themselves with more land than they had before. More resources, but also more loss around them. The landscape of late 14th century Europe is one of presence and absence together. Physicians continue to study the plague. They observe which people seem more likely to recover. They note that certain behaviors seem to help. Movement away from an affected area, what we would now call quarantine, is tried in some Italian cities. Venice is among the first to implement systematic quarantine measures. Ships arriving in Venice are required to wait in the harbor before passengers can disembark. The waiting period is eventually standardized at 40 days. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta. This is where the word quarantine comes from. These early quarantine measures show that people of the 14th century are not passive. They observe, they reason, they try new things. They cannot identify the bacterium. They cannot prescribe an antibiotic. But they look at the evidence they have and try to build responses. Some of their responses are wrong. Some, like quarantine, point in useful directions. The trade routes that brought the plague to Europe continue to function during and after the outbreak. Merchants find ways to continue their work. Commerce is too essential to stop entirely. But there are disruptions. Some routes become more dangerous. Some markets are quieter. The economic geography of Europe shifts gradually in the plague's wake. In the decades after the initial outbreak, there is a period of significant change in European society. The feudal system, the arrangement by which peasants work the land in exchange for protection from lords, begins to loosen. Workers have more leverage. In some parts of England, laborers begin to move between estates, seeking better wages. Parliament passes laws called the Statute of Laborers, trying to keep wages at pre-plague levels. But the laws are difficult to enforce. The economic reality has changed. Universities, which were established in many European cities during the 12th and 13th centuries, continue to function through the plague years. Their populations are reduced. Some scholars and students die. Others flee to the countryside during outbreaks. But the universities survive. They continue to teach medicine, law, philosophy, and theology. They are institutions built to last. The written records of the plague period give us specific details about what it was like to live through it. A monk named Henry Knighton, writing in England, describes the silence in some villages. He writes of fields full of grain with no one to harvest them. He writes of animals wandering without owners. His words are sad and specific. They describe a landscape that had recently been full of people and was now strangely empty. Another chronicler, writing in Avignon in southern France, describes seeing bodies left in the streets. Avignon at this time is the seat of the papacy. The popes had moved from Rome to Avignon in the early 14th century. Avignon is a wealthy and crowded city. The plague hits it hard. Pope Clement VI, who is living in Avignon during the outbreak, follows the advice of his physician. He spends much of his time alone. He sits between two large fires. His physician believed the heat would purify the air around him. The Pope survives. Whether the fires helped is uncertain. But it is a vivid image from the historical record. We move slowly forward in time. The plague years pass one by one. The most severe period of the first outbreak is largely over by 1353. The immediate emergency, the sense of total crisis, begins to ease. But the world that remains is different from the world that came before. People who survive often speak of living in a changed place. Families are smaller. Communities are smaller. The faces at the market are different. Some professions have lost so many practitioners that they need to be rebuilt. Scribes, physicians, lawyers, clergy, all suffer losses and must slowly replace what was lost. In some ways, the labor changes that follow the plague eventually benefit the survivors. Wages rise over time. Workers gain more autonomy. Land becomes more available. Diet may even improve in some cases, as grain prices fall and meat becomes more accessible to ordinary people. These are slow changes. They take decades, and they happen against a background of continued grief and disruption. The relationship with death changes in this period. Before the plague, death was familiar. People died young and old. Disease and accident were common. But the scale of death in the plague years is something new. Whole families disappear. Entire neighborhoods are empty. The normal processes of mourning, the funerals, the prayers, the burial rites, become impossible to maintain when so many are dying at once. This creates a different relationship with loss, something more collective, something shared across an entire society. Over time, the plague becomes a feature of European life. Not the acute crisis of 1347 to 1353, but a recurring visitor. People learn to recognize the signs. They develop practices for protecting themselves, some effective, some not. Quarantine procedures become more sophisticated. Cities develop systems for tracking deaths and detecting outbreaks early. These are the beginnings of what we would now call public health. The plague will return to Europe many times over the following 300 years. One of the most famous later outbreaks is the Great Plague of London in 1665. But that is far in the future from where we are now. For now, we remain in the 14th century, in the aftermath of the first great wave, in the quiet that follows an enormous storm. The countryside of Europe in the late 1350s and 1360s is gradually beginning to recover. Villages that lost people are slowly repopulated. Abandoned fields are slowly returned to cultivation. New families form. Children are born. The basic rhythms of agricultural life, planting and harvesting, tending animals, preparing food, continue. They are always continuing. This is the deep foundation of human life in this period. In the cities, recovery is also slow, but cities attract migrants from the countryside. People who have lost land or family connections move toward towns in search of work. The labor shortage draws people in. This is also a way that ideas and people begin to move more freely. Italy, which was among the first to experience the plague, is also among the first to begin recovering. And the cultural changes that follow the plague in Italy are among the most profound in European history. In the latter half of the 14th century and into the 15th century, Italy begins to develop what we now call the Renaissance, a renewed interest in classical learning, new approaches to art and architecture, a shift in how educated people think about the human being and the human experience. Some historians have argued that the plague plays a role in this cultural shift. The experience of mass death may have changed how people valued human life and human achievement. The awareness that death could come so suddenly may have intensified interest in what could be made and built and known in this life. These are large arguments, and they are debated among scholars. But the connection between the plague and the cultural changes that follow it is one of the interesting threads in the history of the period. Giovanni Boccaccio, who described the plague in Florence, also wrote the Decameron. It is a collection of 100 stories told by a group of young people who have retreated to a country house to escape the plague in the city. They tell stories to pass the time. The stories range from funny to sad to romantic. They are a record of human life, human desire, and human humor in the shadow of catastrophe. The Decameron is one of the great works of medieval Italian literature, and it begins with one of the most detailed accounts of the plague that we have. The poet Petrarch, who lived through the plague years, writes about losing friends and loved ones. He writes with grief that is quiet and specific. He describes a world emptied of people he knew. His letters from this period give us a sense of personal loss within the larger historical event. We slow down now. We let the years drift forward gently. The 14th century comes to a close. The Black Death has reshaped Europe in ways that will take generations to fully understand. It has changed who owns land. It has changed who does work and for what pay. It has changed the church and the clergy and how people practice religion. It has changed art and literature and how people think about death. It has changed the size and shape of populations across an entire continent. But through all of it, ordinary life continues. People wake in the morning and tend their fires. They feed their animals. They bake their bread. They walk to the well or the river for water. They go to the market. They talk to their neighbors. They pray. They sleep. The children who are born in the later 14th century grow up in a different world than their grandparents knew. They know fewer people. Their village is smaller perhaps. But they also know something their grandparents did not. They know that a great sickness came and passed, that people survived, that the fields were eventually harvested, that the spring came again. This knowledge that something devastating can be lived through is part of what the plague leaves behind. Along with the grief and the empty houses and the changed institutions, there is also the knowledge of continuity, of survival, of the ordinary persistence of human life. And so we come gently to the end of this narration. The world of the 14th century is far from us. Its people lived without the things we consider ordinary, without the medicine that can now treat what killed them, without the knowledge of what the illness actually was. They lived with uncertainty in a way that is difficult to imagine. And yet they were people, fully, completely people. They worked and rested. They loved and grieved. They tried to understand the world they lived in. They built institutions, wrote books, made art, and they endured. The Black Death is one of the most significant events in the history of the world. Its effects shaped European civilization for centuries. They touched everything: economics, religion, art, medicine, the structure of society. And they were felt most deeply not in the great halls of kings and popes, but in the small villages and crowded city streets where ordinary people tried to live their ordinary lives. The fire in the hearth burns low. The night is quiet. The village rests. The fields are dark and still. Somewhere far ahead in time, spring will come again, and the people who remain will walk out into it and begin again.